I want to start by introducing our panelists, because I know you're really here to hear from them. So if you can just, as I announce you, just come up to the stage, that would be great. So Diya Patel is the founder of Improve the Dream, which is a youth-led grassroots organization that supports and advocates for young immigrants who have grown up in the U.S. as child dependents of visa holders, but are facing aging out of the immigration system. Since 2017, through Improve the Dream, Diya has advocated to permanently end aging out for over 200,000 documented dreamers. And then Meghna Damani is an award-winning filmmaker and advocate for H-4 dependent visas. She has focused on producing films that try to explore identity, spirituality, social justice. She really has dedicated her life to advocating for work authorization for dependent spouses with her autobiographical film, Heart Suspended, that really broke the silence on the issue. It was screened at the Indian National TV and also festivals worldwide. And then our last in-person panelist is Brent Renison, who is an immigration attorney with Parrilli Renison. He has been an immigration lawyer since 1997. He has received a number of legal awards, including being named by Law and Politics as a super lawyer. He served as an adjunct associate professor at the University of Oregon and has lectured regionally and nationally on immigration law politics. And then our final speaker, who I think you'll see on the screen in a second, is Todd Schulte, who is the president of Forward.us, which is a bipartisan political and policy advocacy organization that's really focused on fixing our broken immigration and criminal justice systems. Prior to this role, he served as chief of staff at Priorities USA Action, which is the super PAC that supported President Obama's re-election, and before that served as chief of staff for Congressman Scott Murphy. All right. And I want to start really with an open question. Obviously, the theme of this discussion today is dream with ambition, which is an optimistic kind of theme, in some ways meeting after the devastating Buffalo shootings, which were in part driven by replacement theory and anti-immigration sentiment. I think it's an important time. Obviously, we're also meeting just after some important primaries. And we know that immigration is going to continue to be a key issue in the midterms. And so I want to ask each of the panelists, if you could sort of describe and maybe share an example of how the American dream has served you, as well as maybe an example in which the dream feels, out of reach or broken. And maybe, Brent, I'll just start with you and go down the line.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, being born in the United States, the American dream has served me quite well. But my paternal ancestors actually came from India 1,000 years ago, the Roma, who were persecuted through Europe. And my family, my great-grandfather, came to the United States in 1906. And when he came, there was no green card, there were no quotas, he just came. And then 5 years later, declare his intention to be a US citizen, and then he became a citizen. We have a system now, quotas and racial discrimination, that is shameful. And it's working. It's working better for others, and very badly for some few people, including mostly Indian-born applicants. And so I've worked to try to do some things, and we can talk about some of the things we can all do here. But some of us who have had the opportunity need to step up and help those who are struggling badly now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brent. That's so important. us helping. So my journey has been a long journey. The community that I work with primarily are families and women on dependent spouse visas. For them, the American dream is pretty elusive. It's kind of like the proverbial, dangling carrot. Like you think you just got it, and then it just moves like beyond your reach. So to share, to better understand these communities, I'll share my journey. So I came here in 2002 after getting married to my husband, who had a work visa. And at the time I was in India, I was working, I had a, crazy job in advertising. And so when he told me, you won't be able to work, I said, yay, I'm happy I won't be able to work. But I didn't realize, what a nightmare it was going to be, because for 5 long years I couldn't work, and I spiraled quickly into a depression, and still struggle with, chronic anxiety, from that time period, and to the point where I even contemplated suicide, and I had to, go back to India while my husband was here. We were separated, and thankfully I found a spiritual practice me come back, and I met a lot of women like me, and I ended up making a documentary, personal documentary about that, which I used to advocate and bring awareness. And it was really shocking to see how many people were not aware of this at all. And after that, the good news was that there was change in 2015. About 100,000 dependent spouses were given work authorization, which was unheard of at that time. However, they still face so many challenges. Meanwhile, I did become a citizen, so that was, a happy ending, so to speak, but not really, because I feel really responsible, for all the women I advocate for. And, for them, with the green card backlog and everything, it's not such a rosy picture. And then also with the women who have the EAD, they have so many issues now, where they expire, and then, they have to lose their jobs, for 6 months at a time. And also they struggle, with abuse, with exploitation. And so there's like tremendous work to be done, which I'll go into more detail later. I'll pass it on.
So there's so many different parts of our immigration system that are very broken, but one particular aspect that's affected me and a lot of people in this room is the process of aging out, which affects more than 200,000 children of long-term visa holders. And so what the American dream is really what's driving us to fight for change that we are. There's over 40 people here, members of Improve the Dream and Documented Dreamers, who face aging out, and we're advocating for a pathway to citizenship and a permanent end to aging out, which means that there's a process where children who are brought here legally in the country can be raised and educated here, but still be forced to leave after they turn 21. And that's one of the many broken parts of the system, but it highlights the need to create different reforms so that we can all achieve our American dream.
Wonderful. And then Todd, can I bring you in?
Yeah, and I'll apologize. I know no one's ever heard this before, but my family member tested positive. So if you hear children screaming in the background, that's on your end and not my kids downstairs. So I'm sorry I can't be there today. In terms of the American dream, and I'm sorry I'm getting a little feedback. I don't know if you all are hearing it too. I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about like what is America, America is lots of things. And we like to think about it as how can America live up to the best of its ideals, and how can we, in the case of our immigration work, how do we build an immigration system that lives up to the best of those ideals, and one that allows people who are here today not just to fight to eventually be able to stay, and not just for people who come in the future to be able to come for some period of time. We should be building a new immigration system entirely, one that's humane and modern and sustainable, that allows people to come and fully contribute right away. And whether that is a mom who is coming to the border because it's the last good chance for her and her kids to seek asylum, or a mom-to-be who's graduating from the University of Missouri, where I'm from, who wants to go on and work as an engineer or work in the transportation sector. We should make it easier for all those people to come. We shouldn't just have this like low bar of do people get to stay. We should be clearing the backlog. We should be giving people not just a work permit, but the ability and encouraging and doing everything we can to get people onto a pathway to naturalize here. And that to me is ultimately what an immigration system that upholds the best to what the American dream should be about.
Thank you, Todd. And I'll add my own personal story. Obviously, from Neil, you heard that I was in school for a very long time, but on a personal basis, immigration is an important issue to me because my parents fled a civil war in Sri Lanka and came to the US when I was 9 months old. And I know that this story is going to resonate with a lot of people because my parents came. They had no jobs. Just $200. I feel like immigrants always come with $200, but my parents came with $200 and 2 very young kids in their arms. And it was Baltimore that welcomed us. My dad became a Baltimore City public school teacher, taught for 37 years in Baltimore City, finally retired when my daughter was born at the age of 80. He was the oldest public school teacher in the state of Maryland. And it was, Baltimore that welcomed us. And it was that gave us the opportunity to go to schools like, Yale and Oxford and Yale Law. And I know that my daughter, who's now 4, will have a better life because my own parents' lives were hard. And to me, that's the American dream, right? And I think it is such a devastating reality to see immigrants ostracized and the fear-mongering that we see today because they are us. They're just the newest generation or wave of it. And I think for me, what scares me to death is our country has turned our backs on our roots. And it is not just the right thing to do, right? It's a smart thing to do, whether it's for our economic interests or national security or because so many religions are called, to this issue as a matter of faith. And yet it's a polarizing issue. And so that's where I think I'm really grateful for this discussion because you may not have kind of worked on this issue for much of your career. I certainly hadn't. But this is the time for us to lean into it. So I want to talk about a few specific issues. And I want to start with DACA and the pathway to citizenship for children. So this June marks the 10-year anniversary of DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this is obviously an Obama administration policy that protects undocumented young people known as dreamers who enter the country as children from deportation and kind of provides them with work permits. So I want to start maybe with Brent in terms of what impact has DACA had on immigrant communities and the South Asian immigrant community specifically?
Well, DACA has been vital to the undocumented population, and I think when we're talking about documented and undocumented from the standpoint of somebody who came here as a child, they don't really care. It doesn't matter. I mean, and DACA has made significant shifts in entire populations, giving hope and opportunity to people who have great things to do for the community. I have a dentist now, a dentist client who is from Mexico. There's no way he would have become a dentist if he didn't have DACA. I'm now looking at the 10-year anniversary going, my gosh, I can't remember. I've been renewing these 2-year DACAs all this whole time. However, who's left out, oddly, is people who came with a visa and who are not out of status on a certain date. It's long ago now, but you had to show you were out of status, and so they've left out some people. So while it has impacted all manner of people across the spectrum, from the South Asian community to the Hispanic community, it really for the documented dreamers, it's fallen short.
And Deep, I want to bring you into this conversation as well, but I also want to ask you about documented dreamers, because it's estimated that more than 200,000 children of long-term visa holders, mostly of Indian origin, risk facing self-deportation when they turn 21 and age out of their dependent status. So you founded a youth-led organization. It's wonderful to see this group leading the charge on this issue. And I guess I wanted to ask you, can you provide some context of what this issue is, and then maybe share some policy solutions that your group is advocating for?
Yes. So on the first on the issue of DACA, DACA is it was a great policy that helped nearly 1 million people access work authorization and protection from deportation. And actually, when it was announced on the day that I saw, the press releases and on the news, when I saw it, it seemed like it was actually something that would help me as well, because while we grow up on dependent visa statuses, we don't have work authorization. And when it was announced, it seemed like I met all of those qualifications. You had to have been here before, June 15, 2007, been present on the date that DACA was announced in 2012, and I felt I met all of those. But then once the applications rolled around, it required you to also have been undocumented. So that, it didn't make sense to me, and I was confused why that was the case. But at the time, I also didn't know this was something that was affecting hundreds of thousands of others, approximately 250,000. So it's something that was an oversight and something that wasn't prioritized previously, but that also is what inspired me and all of us to be in this movement to bring change to not only DACA or other administrative policies, but hopefully a permanent legislative fix, so no one in the future has to go through this. No child who grows up in the United States should have to face aging out or self-deportation. And our vision from that we had been advocating for years was finally introduced on a bipartisan basis in both the House and the Senate last year. And that's one of the policy solutions, America's Children Act. And what that would do is essentially create a mechanism where if someone's brought here as a child, they've been here for 10 years and complete higher education in the United States, they would be able to get a green card. And I think a lot of people in this room probably might think, well, why wasn't that already the case, right? That's exactly the question I think most of my friends and most Americans probably would say, because they don't realize that that doesn't already exist. And so that's one of the solutions. And also, the bill would have other age-out mechanisms that ensure that children don't age out at 21 if they have a pending green card application.
And Deep, I think you raise a really important issue, which is, what is the information that's out there? How are we communicating on these issues? And so, Meghna, I want to bring you in on that. Obviously, as a documentary maker, as an H-4 dependent spouse yourself, you have engaged with many of these youth. So could you talk a little bit about kind of your experience on these issues and what you've seen?
Yeah, thank you. So, primarily as a documentary filmmaker, I've been focusing on the women. And recently, while I was filming one of the women, she stepped away and I was talking to her daughter. And that was the first I had, learned about this issue. And her daughter told me that, when I grow up, I want to be a NASA scientist. And I was like, that's so exciting. And she said, you know what, I wrote to the senator, but I'm afraid because after I become 18, I may have to leave. Sorry, once I age out, I'll have to, leave the country. And this is where I grew up, and I've never been to India. I don't know anyone. And I was just so, struck by the fear, the anxiety on her face. And I was thinking to myself, here is this girl, she wants to contribute to this country. She wants to be a scientist. And, we're going to lose her because, of this restriction. And soon after that, I found out about the trauma that, these kids go through. And I heard of one story where, one girl, she was so anxious and frustrated, she was actually punching holes into, the wall of her room. And, her mom was on a dependent visa but had been laid off because her renewal hadn't come through. So they couldn't even afford a therapist, and they had to pay out of pocket, to help their daughter. And so, while these kids are also seeing their parents going through all of this, and they themselves are going through all of this, so it's just a lot. And so, when I met Deep and, everyone, all the kids here, I was just so inspired by what they're doing, because, this is something that is, extremely urgent for everything that they're going through.
I want to talk about policy and then kind of more about people. So, Todd, I just want to ask you, can you talk a little bit about how people in this room could help advocate, really push Congress in terms of implementing solutions? Deep obviously mentioned bipartisanship, which is refreshing at the moment.
Yeah, I think actually that's a great place to start, which is how does a bill become a law? It's actually a pretty important thing, I think, to remember, which is with notable exceptions, things like what's called the Budget Reconciliation Act. You need to get 218 votes in the House, but you need 60 votes in the United States Senate. And that is inherently a bipartisan enterprise there. It's a huge testament to the work that Deep and so many people in the work have done to see the incredible momentum building around this, as well as the just incredible momentum that we've seen over the last couple of years on a lot of the other issues that we've discussed. I think it is really important, first and foremost, to understand that elected officials are accountable to people that they're hearing from, to their constituents, but they're really responsive to people who they are talking to at that moment. They are human beings, and when they sit down and they hear a pretty basic ask, and they understand here's a problem, and here's what a solution is. We want the DREAM Act to be amended to include folks who would otherwise be aging out. Can you help us by saying you will support the DREAM Act, and if it includes this and it includes its policy there. So I think good advocacy things that people can do are number one, make sure you're in touch with your member of Congress or other members of Congress that you know. Two, make sure you're in touch with your senators. And then when you have that opportunity to sit down with people, don't ask for someone's support on an issue. Tell them exactly what you want them to do. You want them to co-sponsor the bill, and you want them to publicly call for it to come to a vote. You want their vote when it's coming up for final passage. That specificity, I think, is really important, because the easiest thing a politician can give, when you say, hey, could you have your support on this issue? They're always going to say yes. And I think nailing down co-sponsorships and move them up that chain there is ultimately what's going to get this done.
I think that's a great point. I can also tell you from my vantage point, I'll meet regularly with members of Congress who, we're a nonpartisan organization, but you'll see them kind of thick as thieves with a picture of them and President Trump. And you sort of go in as an immigration organization feeling like you need to have your body armor on as you're advocating around immigration. And they will, start out by saying, I care deeply about immigration. It's been an issue of revitalization for my city, or my constituents, businesses care about this a lot. And I think, to Todd's point, part of this is asking them to not just say that behind closed doors, right? But actually voting the right way and saying the right thing. Because I do think that we need to have more vocal supporters on this. And then, Brent, I want to ask you, in terms of people, you've obviously represented clients who are aging out, who are dependent spouses. Kind of from your vantage point as an immigration lawyer, kind of what have you been seeing as of late?
Well, actually, what I've been seeing during this particular week is a lot of amazing advocacy and exactly what we need to see. I started doing this practice of immigration law 25 years ago, but 20 years ago I got involved in helping widows of U.S. citizens who were being deported because they'd been married less than 2 years, and that was the law. If your U.S. citizen spouse died before you were married 2 years, you could be deported, even with a child. So we started doing just what you're doing, which is going around to offices and cramming yourselves in there and telling your stories, going and talking to the media, because the media is the fourth branch of government, okay? Filing lawsuits, we filed a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, challenging on equal protection grounds this disparate, discriminatory treatment that people are getting, pressing the administration to see what they can do. Here, the administration could do some things to lessen the pain, to keep you all here doing the good work that you're doing. DACA was important for those advocates to be able to stay here, to be able to keep contributing to their communities, to be able to advocate for change. We need something like that for your community. We need it urgently, and we need it now. And so you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, and there is hope. It took me and the group of widows and widowers about 6 years to change 5 words in the statute, but we did it. And you can do it too, and you're doing exactly what you need to do. But the one thing is, though, that only VIPs can do this. And how many of you here are VIPs? Please, all of you, raise your hand, because you're all very important. Every single thing that you do makes a difference. Keep a notebook, call, put the year, because it might take a couple of years, but you really need to start calling news stations. If you have a story, tell them your story. You start visit the offices, call them on a weekly basis. Anyone can do this, and then tell your friends about it too, and ask them to do something too. Anyone can make a difference.
Yeah, clearly we have a humble group here in terms of underestimating your power. I want to talk about the green card backlog. And so maybe I'll start by asking just, there's an estimated more than 1 million people, again, mostly of Indian origin, who are stuck in the employment-based green card backlog. And though we are in 2022, in some ways we feel like we are back a century ago when we was the 1920s and we were talking about quotas per country. So maybe I'll ask either Todd or Deep to come in to this conversation and just talk a little bit about why is the backlog so large, and why is it affecting so many people of Indian origin?
So the green card backlog, it primarily affects Indian immigrants, and the primary reason for that is there's a law that there's a 7% per country caps on employment-based visas. So our immigration system has 2 primary ways you can get green cards: through the employment-based system, if you're sponsored by an employer, or the family-based system. So under the employment-based system, there's a quota of 7% based on your country of birth. Unfortunately, there's more qualified applicants from India that were born in India than the number of available spots at the 7% quota. So essentially what happens is every year there's going to be a backlog that continues to grow, and over the last decade, for the most part, it's really gotten a lot worse, and I think it's reaching over 1.2 million.
Appreciate that. And then, Meghna, I want to ask you about the dependent spouse restrictions. Your documentaries really feature, in a very personal way, the brave immigrant women who have faced these unjust restrictions on dependent spouse visas. So can you describe some of the restrictions and the impact that they've had on the women that you've interviewed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking. So when you're on a dependent spouse visa, basically you don't have any status in the country. You don't have a social security number. You can't open your own bank account. In many states, you can't even get a driver's license without your husband. I remember I had gone, with my husband's passport, and they said, where's your husband? I said, he's working. I have his passport, and that wasn't enough. He needed to be there physically. And in the case of abusive husbands, they're not going to show up if they don't want the woman to get a license. Also, you cannot volunteer anywhere. You can only volunteer for nonprofits. So these are, the restrictions. But of course, that leads to even more deeper issues, such as, women losing their self-confidence, struggling with anxiety, depression, which affects their relationships with their spouses, their children. There are a lot of divorces. Of course, one woman I interviewed, her husband actually sent her back to India saying, you need to go back, I'm going to send, the documents, we need to get our papers renewed. And then he decided that he didn't want her to come back. So he never sent the documents. She was stuck there for years. She developed an acute, very rare virus when she was bedridden for 6 months. And that's just one story of like millions of stories of abuse. And then of course there's exploitation, by employers who promise women green cards and H1s, and they don't, they really make them work very hard, they don't get it. In the case of women who have got the EAD, I've found a lot of them overcompensate, working 2-3 times more than, trying to make up for the gap. So, technically you've lost the prime working years of your life. And so by the time you get your green card or even the EAD, you're in your 40s. By then, you have children, you're, balancing your family life as well as this. So it pretty much, destroys your life, I would say. And then on top of that, these are people, who the US has invited. They're highly skilled workers, so they have been invited here. And this is the way their spouses and children are being treated. It's just inconceivable in this day and age.
Yeah. Now I want to shift gears and talk about Afghan and Ukrainian refugees. Part of what I wanted to do with this panel was not just talk about any specific issue, because candidly, part of why we see such significant challenges in immigration is you have constituencies around specific and sometimes narrow issues, but the reality is there is a broader movement, right, that we have to build. And so I want to direct this question, Todd, to you. Whether it was the crisis we saw in the evacuation of of Afghans, or with Ukrainian refugees who have come to the U.S. On the one hand, there has been stronger support, frankly, than we have seen in historical examples. I think it's pretty poignant when, in the Syrian crisis in 2015, we had 31 governors come out against welcoming Syrian refugees. And part of what you saw was Islamophobia. But last year, when we welcomed Afghan allies, we had 37 governors come out in favor of welcoming Afghan refugees. I went on to Glenn Beck and sort of thought I was going into the lion's den, but he was incredible about saying, what can my audience do to help? So Todd, I want to ask you kind of, what is the misinformation that we are hearing about these groups, but also what is the opportunity that we have in welcoming some of these specific demographics that may have more bipartisan support than other groups?
I'll start on the misinformation question. I think it is really important to be clear that there is an exceedingly well-funded and organized anti-immigrant movement in this country. Like, this isn't just some like latent opinion that exists out there. There are groups who, are very clear. They will talk about things like, they will use scary terms. They'll scare people around things around the border and talk about security. They'll scare people about Syrian refugees. When you read their policy papers, it's really clear they want to shut down legal immigration as much as possible. They'll use terms like moratorium, and they will scare people with pictures at the southwest border. And then when you look at things like the RAISE Act that were introduced previously, it was geared towards slashing family-based immigration, incredibly geared towards shutting off immigration from Asia. And I just think, that is really important to understand. We live in an ecosystem in which people are not trying to play on a fair field around facts, and people will lie about economics and all sorts of things there. I think when you look at what happened with Afghanistan, I'll speak personally for a second. I think it was personally very thrilled to see a war come to an end there, and deeply disappointed, to put it mildly, in the manner in which planning went into the extraction of, roughly 250,000 people who had served alongside and in support of our armed forces there. But you saw this real commitment, and I think that is real, and bipartisan support there. I think 37 governors. It is a real sea change from what we saw 7 years ago. But you continue to see, and I think, as a policy organization, we haven't passed the Afghan Adjustment Act yet. In Ukraine, you have seen a similar folks who have stepped up to welcome folks there. And at the same time, you have seen the disparate treatment of people who are in Ukraine, most of whom come to someplace else who are Black, for example, who've been treated disparately at the border there. And we need to have ultimately not just the ability, I think we should welcome people in these moments here, but where we fall down is when we're not building capacity for the long term, when the refugee resettlement organizations, I'm not the expert on this call on this, are being intentionally starved of funds by a previous administration, where we don't have the ability to have people come on an H-1B and get those rights right away as a spouse, or get onto a green card right away. We need resilient legal immigration avenues that are working for all the different ways, with forced migration, employment-based migration, family-based migration, and the overlap between them that works. And so we should welcome these people. We need to surge the best of what America can do into those moments, but we need to build capacity in the long term so we can be ready to do that.
Yeah, Todd, and I think it's really important to understand that even though the Obama administration has been more welcoming than the prior administration, we are well over halfway through the fiscal year. And though President Biden increased the number of refugees that could be admitted from all over the world to 125,000, we've only accepted 13,400. And this is one of those issues, right, where there has been historically bipartisan support. We actually resettled the highest number of refugees under President Reagan. One of President Reagan's last speeches talked about the importance of immigration. So I think, Todd, your point in terms of that employment authorization, kind of that pathway to citizenship is obviously critical. And I want to segue now to one of the last two questions I'm going to ask, which is related to sort of the economy. So, 11.5 million jobs are going unfilled right now. I think we've tried to explain that immigrants are not coming to steal Americans' jobs. In many cases, they are filling jobs that would otherwise go unfilled. But I think at the same time, there is this kind of view of the model minority, right? There is this view of, especially when you think about South Asian immigrants as, high-skilled STEM workers or, doctors. And in recent weeks, we've seen a UPenn law professor, as well as Tucker Carlson, make disparaging remarks about immigrants coming and trying to sort of take over. So I want to open this up to anyone on the panel who wants to discuss this, but we also know that members of the South Asian community are filling key roles, whether that is, Uber drivers or hospital workers, store clerks. And I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that, 600,000 plus of these workers are estimated to be undocumented. I think we're slowly coming out of the pandemic, but we know so many of these immigrants were essential workers on the front lines. So how do we ensure that we are making headway on specific policy issues, but that we're also taking care of all immigrant populations? Is that possible?
Anyone?
Go ahead, Brent.
Well, I think some perspective is needed because I think this anti-immigrant rhetoric obviously comes from some racist backgrounds, but others are just simply misinformed. And I think most people don't understand, with 329 million people in this country, we admit as permanent residents 1 million, and half of those 1 million are spouses of U.S. citizens. This is a 0.25% of the U.S. population each year immigrates legally. It is a very small amount. And then on the employment side, 140,000 is the cap. And they count family members. So that's not even the workers, it's the spouses, children. So a small amount. And then for the national origin discrimination we have here, 7%. 7% of that is a few thousand per year. If the backlog is 200,000, that's why they come up with a 100-year wait. You see, I have clients who immigrated when I was first practicing from India, all different countries. And if you immigrated in the 90s, you do not understand the struggles that are happening to people today, or in 90s or before, because the backlogs were not that long. But if you want to look to people who've been struggling for many decades, look to Mexico and the Philippines. If you want to petition for your child, you're going to wait 3 decades. And that's why people come illegally, because they want to join their family members and the law doesn't allow them. The Indian community and soon the Chinese community are going there very soon. We need massive revamping of our immigration laws, and Numbers USA is against it, and they have a stranglehold on the GOP. And so how do you do that? How do you untie that? What you have to do is go on to the media and start being interviewed about your story. Cite these statistics. Please know your statistics, because it is unfair, the system we have, and it's not serving America's interests at all. It is just feeding into the demagoguery and the racist sentiments. And if you just tell it like it is, it's actually very clear that we have an insufficient number of immigrants.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, the power of telling your personal story should not be underestimated. Like, there was one of the women I interviewed who got her H4 EAD. She started a hospital, and she actually employs over 100 US citizens, and they were, frontline workers during COVID. But not too many people know about this, so we have to change the narrative and, really take it into our own hands. Because even when I told my story, nobody knew about this. When it's screened in front of members of Congress, they were amazed, because they were like, we just get numbers, we get statistics. But now that we're hearing your story, we're realizing that there's a human being behind every number. So, that's something that every one of us here can do, I think.
Okay, and final question I'm going to do is sort of rapid fire. We know that an inclusive immigration system isn't something that we can just sort of dream with ambition. We need to act with ambition. So can you give the audience one thing that they can do? Deepa, I'll start with you.
One thing everyone can do, and I think this has been mentioned before today, earlier, but is to tell your story or the story of someone that's impacted. That makes a real difference. It could be, like Brent said, to the media or to your member of Congress, but telling those personal stories to the officials that can actually help. Your personal story, others' personal stories, and I think that's really what's helped us create that awareness for this particular problem. And I think doing that, touching up on your last question as well, doing that is, I think, what will make it possible for even more comprehensive immigration reform to happen, because what prevents that from happening is most Americans also don't understand that it's really not, there really is no pathway, right? There's no real line that people can get into to come here or to do that. So educating them on that, making them realize that, and I think the support would be there.
Yeah, I agree with Deep. On a similar vein, I think, the dialogue is important, and I think dialogue is very different from having a conversation. A dialogue really, it needs effort. It needs effort to go beyond, our own preconceived notions. And I think, instead of waiting for the other person to take the lead, I think, we should all let go of our own. And this is something I really struggle with, trying to do every day, because we all believe we are right. But, how do we look at things from each other's point of view and, have unity around, about, the issues that, we're fighting for. And so in order to advocate for something, first of all, we need awareness, because unless we're aware of something, we can't develop an empathy for it. And so, just having dialogue, like maybe tonight in the gala, like talking to somebody about, something that you're not aware of, learning from them, I think that's really a good starting point.
My only comment is don't do nothing.
Okay, that was short. Todd.
That's pretty hard. Now I shouldn't talk very much. I think we can do all these things we've talked about. The very same people who who we've talked about here, who want to stop a pathway to citizenship and don't want to clear the backlog and want to cut immigration for family-based and employment-based, will all say, well, you can't do X because like you really Y, and they pit folks against one another. And I think we are living in a world in which the American immigration system is essentially and this was said at the top of the speech, so I'll close here. We are living in the world where we have strong echoes from the 1920s. We live in an immigration system that was built as a reaction to that and trying to fix that in the middle of the 20th century. And what we need is an immigration system that accomplishes all the things we've talked about, that leads us into the middle of the 21st century. And we can do that, and we can do all of these things. And it's not about like one versus another. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Like, we are not the defenders of the status quo, and we are not to blame for the faults of it. We are transforming and building a new system.
Appreciate that. And I'm going to use moderator's prerogative to just say that, look, we need every single one of you to be involved. So if you are a business owner or an employer, hire our clients, because we've got a lot of them. If you are a lawyer, help Brent in terms of the number of pro bono lawyers that we need. If you're a communications expert, I think the technical term is that we suck at comms, because Deep is exactly right. When people say, oh, well, they should come the right way, or, well, you know, they're coming for economic reasons, we haven't messaged what this issue is about. And if you want to roll up your sleeves and get involved, there are absolutely ways. This is going to be the battlefield in the next couple of years, and it is going to be a fight for the heart of our nation. So please get involved, and thanks for hearing this panel.